1 million children are growing up in Britain today with no contact from their fathers. But the head of the Catholic Church in England and Wales says fathers are important role models and called their influence a precious gift. Is he right? Or are his words being used as another stick with which to beat single mums? Good morning, I'm Samira Ahmed and welcome to a new series of Sunday Morning Live. Parts of the UK are becoming man deserts. That's according to the Centre for Social Justice think tank, who point to the growth of single mother families and the shortage of male primary school teachers as the cause. So are fathers essential or an optional extra? Here's what one single mum thinks.
My daughter's very happy, she's very settled, she's very confident. And I think actually most single mums would say the same about their kids.
Next week, the governing body of the Church of England meets, and once again, women bishops are high on the agenda. One retired bishop feels the church is being held to ransom by a minority opposed to change.
If the church is not to self-destruct, then it must not impose its prejudices upon the tolerant society in which we live.
And as Nelson Mandela lies critically ill in a South African hospital, we examine arguably his greatest legacy, forgiveness. But is it always right to forgive? My guests this week are Peter Hitchens, a columnist for the Mail on Sunday, and a former atheist who's now a member of the Church of England. Stephen Lowe, now retired, was until 2009 the Bishop of Hume and the Church of England's first Bishop for Urban Life and Faith. And Bonnie Greer is a playwright and novelist. Born in Chicago, she's lived in the UK since 1986. She's Chancellor of Kingston University and once played Joan of Arc on stage in Paris. And we want to know what you think. If you have a webcam, you can join us via Skype. You can also give your views on Twitter or by phone. Phone calls cost up to 5 pence a minute from most landlines. Calls from mobiles may cost considerably more, and texts will be charged at your standard message rate. A report by the Centre for Social Justice says that lone parent families are increasing at the rate of 20,000 a year and will total more than 2 million by the time of the next general election. The vast majority are single mothers. At the same time, the Archbishop of Westminster, Vincent Nichols, and the Pope have both praised the roles of fathers when it comes to child development. Are fathers undervalued figures, or can children gain just as much when raised by a single mother? Sally Whittle has been dealing with the realities of life as a single mum since she and her husband parted in 2007. She has been able to maintain a good relationship with her ex-husband, who still has regular contact with his 7-year-old daughter.
From our experience, my daughter doesn't see her dad every day, and while that would have been lovely, I think what has been important and what is vital is that she has lots of people around her who care, who spend quality time with her, and who she loves spending time with. My daughter's very happy, she's very settled, she's very confident. And I think actually most single mums would say the same about their kids.
The report from the Centre for Social Justice says children that have separated, single or step parents are 50% more likely to fail academically or struggle socially.
Dooming an entire generation of kids because they happen to be being raised by single mothers is just, it's silly. I don't think the problem here is about being single or being married. It's about the challenges that some of those single mums are experiencing.
Sally also runs a blog about parenting for a group of UK parent bloggers. This means she talks to parents from all sorts of different backgrounds every day. She feels there is a growing frustration at the way single mums are portrayed.
You would think that a single mum is somebody in their teens who's had a baby to get council flat and now is on benefits and might have another baby to get, buy a new telly. Lots of single mums either want to work or are working or are in education and training, and it's just incredibly hard.
One of the concerns the CSJ report raises is that many children also lack male role models because of the shortage of men teachers in primary schools.
You'd have to work quite hard to put your child into a man desert. There are uncles, there are cousins, there are grandfathers. I just find it quite funny, the idea that actually you could raise a child and have them not meet 50% of the population.
So are fathers actually as important as the report and many religious and political leaders would have us believe? Or is it just fashionable to stigmatise single mums trying to do their best for their children? A view there from one single mother, Sally. Peter, she suggests it's all about stigmatising them. Families don't necessarily need fathers.
Virtue is learned by example, and an awful lot of children are not learning that men are capable of constancy, of fidelity, of hard work, or of restraint or of responsibility. They simply aren't seeing it, and so both girls and boys are growing up without any idea that this is the case. And unsurprisingly, our society is affected by that. If people think it can't be done, then they don't do it and they don't expect it.
Well, that is the question for our text vote. Do families need fathers? Text the word vote followed by yes or no to 81771. Texts will be charged at your standard message rate. You can only vote once and you can go online to vote for free. Results will be announced at the end of the show. Visit bbc.co.uk Sunday Morning Live, where you can also read full terms and conditions. And we know there's already a lively debate online. We'll be reading out some of your comments as we go through the show. Bonnie, you know, there is all this research which is showing there is a connection between single parenthood, overwhelmingly mothers, and the fact that their children don't tend to go on to do so well in life.
Well, I mean, this is a very complex question. First of all, I grew up in a traditional family. That is, my father was with us at home, and he stayed married to my mother until his death. They were married for almost 50 years, and I think I benefited by knowing my father. I benefited by him being there, but it is not some sort of generic benefit. I benefited because of his personality and who he was. But we do know that fatherhood is a recent invention in human society.
How do you mean?
Well, we going all the way back in the millions of years of our species, it took a long time for people to realize that men were connected with birth. We didn't learn that until probably the age of farming and so forth. So it's a recent invention, and that what I'm saying.
You basically think it's a social construct, the construct
totally
of fatherhood.
Of course, it is totally that, and that's not to denigrate it, but I don't think we should mystify it because fatherhood is not.
This is where we bring in Stephen Lowe. Fatherhood has been mystified, often by church leaders.
Yeah, I'm not sure I could agree with Bonnie on that. I do think that I don't want to stigmatise a single parent, be it even gay parents. I don't want to stigmatise them because they are involved in a single-sex relationship with children. But on the other hand, I do think fathers do bring something important, as Bonnie's actually just said, to a relationship, which is an important part of a child flourishing. And I think the loss of that role is a loss to a family, whereas I think even that single parent we heard just now actually acknowledged that they do need male figures in their life.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying the idea of fatherhood that we're talking about now is a couple of 100 years old construct, that dads were there, that they took care of their children.
Isn't that better?
Look, I don't know what it's like not to have a dad, but I'm saying we have to separate out the mystification of fatherhood and the fact that it is good to have a dad, and I empathize with men who want to be fathers. I really support them. But let's not mystify fatherhood.
Okay.
Motherhood is the essential connection that human beings have.
Peter.
Can we just shift away from this suggestion which has been repeatedly made that this is about stigmatizing or being unpleasant to single parents? It's nothing to do with that. Single parents have in many cases made a rational choice given the social attitudes of our society and indeed the tax and benefits system which encourages the formation of fatherless families. It's nothing to do with them as individuals. What we're addressing is the way in which politicians and Parliament since the late 60s has deliberately encouraged this form of family. And we now find, and the whole point of the Centre for Social Justice report, which everybody should read, is that this has been a failure. Now, why is it that having experienced this enormous failure and having created large numbers of fatherless families and found that the results are in many cases worse than they would otherwise have been, we don't do anything about it?
All right,
and it's
Bonnie.
always diverted into you're attacking single mothers. I'm not attacking single mothers.
No,
I'm attacking the government for creating so many
Let me go back to
fatherless families.
what Peter's saying. Governments made decisions about not defining families. It didn't say you are family because you have a daddy and a mommy. It said you are family if you have a child. The child is what we're going to focus on. Now, of course, I agree, it hasn't been perfect. Of course it hasn't. It's decayed. It needs to be looked at. But but governments decided to focus on children and
It's
not
been
defining
demonstrably
families.
worse. It's been
well-
demonstrably worse for children, Bonnie. That's the whole point. If it's the victims of this great experiment, in which a lot of adults have had a great deal of fun, have been the children.
Peter, the worstness of it has to do with the fact that in our society, men make more money. Men are able to do more things than women. Women are lower paid. If women have job equality, first of all, it does begin with how much money.
You're changing
Can I
the subject.
Can I just let Stephen in here? One second, Bonnie. Just one moment. Just let Stephen respond.
What I think we've got to be very careful about, Peter, is saying, first of all, that politicians have created single-parent families. Actually, it's very often the violence of men that have created single-parent families towards the women. And that is an important factor in the breakdown of many family relationships. And many of those men have not had good fathering themselves and good modelling for what a good father is. And that's one of the things I would disagree with Bonnie about. I think it's important that people like you, and you said your father provided you with a good model of what a good father actually was.
But I'm not
and
going
we need more of that and encouraging more of that.
But I'm not going to say that because a woman chooses to raise her child without the father of that child, that somehow innately that is going to be a bad thing. That child is going to be ruined. We have a president of the United States whose father was not there. So,
but are we saying that, Bonnie? Aren't we
yes,
actually
we
saying,
are.
isn't it better that there
we're
should be
saying,
both parents there rather than it's a bad thing?
It is better in a society where that is rewarded, not generically, not innately. That's my argument.
It's interesting the way I so often find myself as being more religious than bishops. But isn't it actually something the Church believes very strongly in, that parents of children should be married? And the whole basis of this is actually the Divorce Law Reform Act of 1969, which so weakened marriage and made it less central to our society. All these consequences which follow. It's not easier to get out of a marriage than it is to get out of a car racing
just one second, because I just want to bring in David Lammy here, his Labour MP, who was himself raised by a single parent. David, there's kind of two interesting aspects to this. One is how far you're living proof that you don't need to have had a father to have grown up successfully, but also how far marriage is the issue rather than whether two parents are together, because we know cohabitations tend to break down, as Peter's saying.
Well, look, I was very lucky. I grew up in a tough inner city environment. I went to a boarding school. I got a scholarship, so it was a bit like a Billy Elliot moment. I had uncles and I had an older brother that was 14 years older than me that supported me, and I had some great male teachers. But it does seem to me the issue is not about marriage, it is about fatherhood. If you are old enough to become a father, then that is something that must continue throughout life. Whether your relationship breaks up with the mother or not, you need a relationship with the child, assuming there isn't domestic violence. So I do think that the emphasis should be on fatherhood, because we know that the tendency towards criminality, the outcomes in relation to poverty for children without that stable father relationship is absolutely fundamental and is going up in our society.
But the ingenious method which we developed and which worked over centuries for making sure that fathers did stick around with the children of the women with whom they lived is called marriage. And by abandoning marriage, we have actually made it almost certain that many of those fathers will disappear at crucial points in those children's lives. And not all of them are going to be able to go to boarding school or have, as you rightly say, the very good fortune that you had.
David, respond to that specifically. That cohabitation does make a difference.
Yeah. I'm married and I believe in marriage, but I recognise that in 2013 there are couples who are cohabiting, there are relationships that break down, and indeed there are relationships and children who are born by virtue of casual sex. In those circumstances, I place my emphasis on fatherhood, on staying connected, on staying with it.
But how do you ensure fatherhood without marriage?
Your state should do that job for you.
David, thank you so much,
But
Bonnie.
also on the obstacles
David, just
that face
bear with us a
many
moment.
fathers that want to father, and there are many obstacles in our society, including maternity wards, children's centres and schools that almost are hostile to those often young fathers being engaged.
Oh, that's very interesting, isn't it? Thank you, David.
Let's go back to that, because it is young fathers nowadays who do want to be dads, who want to be fathers, who want to be be engaged. And I encourage that that should happen. And that's going to take us a shift in the way the family is looked at. But the Labour government, New Labour itself, decided that it was going to be children that it was going to focus on. It was not going to define what a family was. I think that to me is important.
On the
Children are the
contrary,
most
New Labour
important.
did a lot to define what it thought a family should be, and it took marriage out of the equation.
Okay.
Official documents under New Labour.
Just a moment.
Official
Peter,
documents
just a
under
moment.
New Labour
Just a moment,
remove the
please.
word husband from official documents. It's
Stephen,
not there
because
anymore.
It's just not true that they took marriage out of the equation.
Certainly.
Fatherhood remains, I agree with everything David said, a very important part of the flourishing of a child. And one of the things our system now does actually is sometimes impose prejudice against fathers exercising their responsibilities. And I'm not saying in many ways that I support fathers and for justice and so on, but there are issues about the way in which our courts still continue to treat fathers and keep them out very often of the proper contact that they should have and want with their children.
Well, I know this is a big issue for many of the viewers who've been commenting from home. A couple of those comments now for you. I think this is Bob. It's not about motherhood or fatherhood, but the need for adults to provide both nourishment and security, whatever the gender. A B. King from Northumbria says, families need fathers. It's a self-evident fact. Evil is done to fathers and their children by wrong assumptions of professionals. And another one, calling father/mother families traditional is old-fashioned. A traditional family in 2013 is increasingly a single-parent family. And we've got one more contributor I'd like to bring in on webcam. Sally Whittle joins us now. Sally, we saw your film earlier. You can see people feel passionately that you're doing really well, but you know what? Having a dad around would be better.
I think, to be honest, talking about it in those kind of terms, the horse has bolted. For lots and lots of families in the UK, there isn't a married father. And I think rather than just discounting that and writing off people like my daughter or saying that somehow I'm not family because I'm not married, that's just... It's pointless. You're missing a massive opportunity to help support those families and help encourage those. And I personally feel very demoralised seeing all of this coverage about single mothers and how I've made the wrong choice and therefore that's now determined my daughter's future. I don't think that's what counts. I think it's about my daughter's in a loving, supportive, nourishing family with lots of male role models, including her dad.
Okay.
And the fact that we're
nobody
not
is
married
making these assumptions.
Sally, thank you.
Nobody is making these assumptions. Nobody said any of these things. What we're discussing here is public policy. 50 years ago, there was a strong pressure for a change in the marriage laws so that they would be weakened and the whole idea of lifelong marriage would be got rid of. And
But the key thing is that people like Sally should be protected.
Now we see, if I can finish the point, now we see the measurable results of this. The Centre for Social Justice report measures the results. They have been disastrous. Wouldn't it be the rational, sane thing for society to do, to go back to the mistake that it made and say, actually, we got this wrong, we need to reform it.
You cannot have a society where one way or another men are abusing women and women very often having to withdraw from married relationships because of that abuse and say we've got to keep them somehow together with a divorce law which is rigorous and prevents people actually separating when there is that sort of abusive relationship.
But I think we're making a distinction between any kind of abusive relationship.
Let's be more profound than that, I agree, but let's be more profound than that. A woman raising a child has always been the way it was. It is only recently that men have been involved with children. And so to make it some sort of mystical thing...
I thought Joseph was a bit involved with Jesus.
That's a couple thousand years ago.
Very briefly,
you know,
Stephen, just a moment, but I do want to bring in one other comment. It's Natasha Fox. Now, you were raised by a single parent, and crucially, your mother chose to have you on her own because she chose to have donor conception. Do you feel, from what you've heard, that, you know, in the end, she made, you know, you've missed out, you needed a father?
No, not at all. Well, naturally, I've always been curious about my donor. I've never felt at a disadvantage from being raised by a single parent because I grew up in a loving and supportive family. And ultimately, to me, that's what's the most important thing throughout your childhood. I understand that no family situation is perfect. And I think assuming that a nuclear family guarantees happiness is unrealistic.
Okay.
My mum did the best she could in difficult circumstances, as do many single mothers who are stigmatised because their family doesn't fit in to what is seen as the ideal structure.
Natasha, thank you.
I think that But thank you.
We'll just leave it there. Peter, just briefly, if we separate off abusive relationships, which people need to escape, and the idea that the state has made single motherhood more attractive, is there also an issue about manhood here, in brief, which is, men are putting off marriage, and I know anecdotally of women who they say, I've got to have a kid on my own, or I'll never have a kid.
Well, marriage is actually very unattractive now to men. There's almost no point in them getting married. All they do, all they do is they take on a legal commitment, and if they get divorced, then they will usually lose the custody of the children and also the family home. You asked me the question. I'm telling you what the arrangement is.
There are millions of families functioning with good fathers in loving relationships. Let's not sort of paint a picture of a world where it's all made up of single parents or men who are feeling very angry.
Read the report. It's not.
I've read the report.
I think we'll end the discussion there, but that's a very good place to end it, Stephen. Thank you. Thanks to everybody. We know this is the big topic of the day. Our poll is open, so do vote. The question: do families need fathers? Remember, you can only vote once. And if you think families do, text the word vote followed by yes. If you think not, text vote followed by no. Our text number is 81771, and text will be charged at your standard message rate. You have around 20 minutes before the poll closes. Now, next week, the General Synod, the ruling body of the Church of England, meets, and high on the agenda is what many see as the biggest challenge facing the Church today, the ongoing dispute over allowing women bishops. Traditionalists in the pews feel the very fabric of church and gospel is being eroded. Others, like retired Bishop Stephen Lowe, feels the Church is lagging woefully behind the times and that its very survival is at stake. This is his Sunday Stand.
If I was in my 20s now, I couldn't ever see a reason for my setting foot in a building like this. The church that I have given the best part of my life to is killing the gospel of Jesus Christ that I passionately believe. It is a gospel that speaks of love, acceptance, and a welcome to all. The church continues to discriminate against women by refusing them the opportunity to join the leadership of the church's bishops. Gay and lesbians are told that their lifestyle is not welcome. This is not reflective of the tolerant society in which we live. If the church is not to self-destruct, then it must reflect that tolerant society and not impose its prejudices upon it. My church has either to change or die. It has to become more tolerant and change with society. Otherwise, what's the point of being left with empty churches and a few old bigots sat in the pews?
The views of retired Bishop Stephen Lowe. Do you agree with him or disagree? You can join in the conversation at home on Twitter, phone, text or email. The details are all on the screen. And I'm going to have to start with you, aren't I? Because, you do go to the Church of England, but, are you in danger of being one of those bigots who's going to help it die?
Well, why didn't the bishop take up social work instead of the church, if that's the way he feels? This is
because I believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ, actually. Jesus Christ talked about love and tolerance and acceptance.
Good for you, but
good for me.
But your view of it is your view, and mine is mine. Which of us is right, we'll find out later, won't we? But I don't think that it's necessarily the case that someone should. Well, put it like this: that if the church marries the spirit of the age, it will pretty quickly find itself widowed. The spirit of the age is exactly what the church is not going to be for. To pursue the fashions of the time is exactly what churches are not supposed to do.
All right,
it has to stand for eternal verities.
Well, exactly.
And to join in with every fashionable cause is not its job.
Jesus Christ spent his time with outsiders, the people who were rejected in society. He preached a gospel of love, tolerance and acceptance. He preached a gospel about justice. Now, we are in a situation at the moment where the church discriminates against women, it discriminates against gay and lesbian people, and as a result, in a society which largely has become more loving and tolerant towards these groups, the church is completely out of step and losing any relevance to those under the age of 30 around those issues.
Bonnie. Christianity is the biggest globalization project that ever was in the history of humankind. As a Roman Catholic, someone was brought up in the Catholic Church, I know that what Christians did was they roll up into a community, there'd be a goddess up there who had a sacred spring, and the priest would say, oh yeah, well, you know, keep her there. Not like Islam that says get rid of the statue. Christianity says keep it, but we'll call her Saint Mary of the whatever. And then suddenly, there it is, the people don't have to go anywhere, they didn't have to do anything.
So your point is that churches already were modernising?
Christianity's definition is change. And 600 years ago, if you were to say the word Christian, you would be, like me, a Roman Catholic. There wasn't anything else. Christianity splits, it changes. And to go back to what Stephen...
I mean, the Catholic Church's attitude to women is arguably more conservative.
I'm not talking about the Catholic Church. I'm talking about Christianity. Christianity's fluidity is built into it.
But we're talking about it now. I mean, you know, Peter, we're in this situation where, you know, the Church of England is arguing over whether to allow a woman boss, essentially.
No, it's not.
And it does seem remarkable,
This is a complete
doesn't it?
misrepresentation.
Still
Can we get this absolutely straight? The Church of England is perfectly happy to have women bishops, and everybody accepts it. The only thing that's being argued about is the conditions under which those who cannot, in conscience, accept the authority of women bishops should be treated.
But if that was about race,
that's not it, Peter.
Those are the facts. It's endlessly misrepresented. But let's just... The Church of England has been modernising frantically. Like a dancing dad at a disco.
The Church of England is modernisation itself. You were founded by a king. You were founded by a king who decided he was going to break away from the family.
Can I finish a sentence?
Just a second, Peter.
Get this sectarian rubbish out.
Peter,
no, it's not sectarian rubbish.
The Church of England has been modernising for 50 years, and all the time it's been modernising, it's been losing congregations.
Okay, that's a specific
modernisation
It has been tried, and it's
if you want to find churches that are full, it's those
the church is
stick
not,
hard by the
inverted
gospel.
commas, modernising. It is actually trying to preach the Christian gospel to a modern society and culture. We got rid of slavery, which was part of the teaching within the New Testament. We got rid of an attitude towards women in the New Testament, which is quite frankly outrageous in modern society. We have to recognise the Christian gospel has to address the 21st century, and the church needs to engage itself in that way.
Okay, well, let me just bring in a contributor here. I want to bring in Susie Leaf, who's a lay member of the General Synod. Now, you know, my understanding is you're against women bishops, and you are, you know, Stephen would say, you know, one of those people who's holding the church to ransom, perhaps, when it needs to modernise, or it won't flourish.
Yeah, I think it's very sad, isn't it, to think that the churches which have a third of their congregations under the age of 30 are the very churches that are saying that they want to maintain male leadership within them. We're called to reflect God as the church, not society, and we're called to take God's word seriously.
Stephen?
Well, God's word, my understanding of God's word is an acceptance of all people as children of God, regardless of in Christ there is neither male nor female, and that is one of the fundamental misunderstandings of the people who go around talking about male headship within the church. It actually isn't the Christian gospel. And these people are supposed to be biblical Christians, yet they don't actually accept the teaching of the Bible.
Susie?
It's absolutely true that in salvation there is no male or female, slave or free. It's absolutely true. All can come to God through Christ. And that's what Paul is teaching in Galatians. It's in a whole passage about how are we saved, not how do we order our churches.
Okay.
Paul also talks very clearly that in the church and in the family, we need male responsibility. Female submission.
I'm conscious that there's a whole discussion we could have about this. I mean, female submission, you know.
Could I just...
I don't, you know, as Peter says, sectarian rubbish. It's not sectarian rubbish, it's a fact. The Church of England itself is a modernization project. And it seems to me, I'm not a practicing Catholic, I'm not here doing anything with the Catholic Church, but I'm saying to mystify this, to make this into some sort of idea that goes back thousands of years. It's not true about Christianity.
Can I just make a point? There's something that the bishop said about how Christ mixed with and saw and met the wrongdoers and the sinners in society. It's absolutely true. And St. Matthew, whose gospel we still read, was one of them. And also St. Mary Magdalene. But he didn't say to them, carry on doing the wicked things that you're doing. He said, stop doing those things, go and sin no more. The fact that he went and spoke to them and mixed with them didn't mean that he approved of what they did. There seems to be this, the attitude that's now being put forward is somehow the church, by accepting the existence of wrongdoers and sinners, accepts their sins as well. The church is not a social work body. It says some things are profoundly,
right.
inevitably
So you're saying gay and lesbian
wrong.
people are sinners and
you should know that. You're a bishop.
Well, I
I'm
do
just
not
a lay
accept
member
that
of the
at
church.
all in any way, shape or form.
I want to bring another contributor here, please, which is Vicky Beeching, who's a theologian. Now, I can remember when women priests were first approved in the Church of England, which was about 20 years ago. Have you ever thought about being a priest?
I have. Well, my work as a theologian means I've actually clocked up more years of theological study than it would take to become a priest. So lots of people ask me why I haven't gone that step further and become ordained. And for me, it is partly about the church's attitude to women. I see it as such a foundational element of the gospel. And I actually don't think this is about the modernization of the church. I was reading Peter's piece in the Mail about how those arguing for women bishops are actually watering down the gospel and chasing culture. But for me, it's actually about stripping off that culture. For me, the culture we're talking about is the patriarchal culture that was over the text when it was written. So I would actually see wanting women bishops to be a return to the original text. So I don't want to modernize the church. I actually want to return to its original essence. So in that sense, Peter is the reformer and I'm not.
Aha. And the Gospel of Mary Magdalene should be back in the Bible then as well, presumably.
No, I didn't say what I've just been alleged to say anyway. I'm all in favour of women bishops. I've got no problem with them at all. My problem is how those who don't agree with it should be treated, because they should be tolerated, as the Church of England has always done, as people with strong conscience-driven views which should be accepted. That's all that argument is about. But it's much more. The Church of England is practically run by women. Anybody who attends Anglican churches knows that. The idea that it has some kind of hostility towards women is just such insupportable rubbish. I'm amazed anyone can still say it.
The attitude to social women, to women in the church, and the fact that they're not allowed to hold those key roles of leadership, I think is the issue.
They could have been bishops years ago if the pro-women bishops faction had been more tolerant of their opponents.
And that is the issue, and that's why Christianity, for me, is inconsistent. How can, if we're going to go back to first principles, you're saying then that God made two tiers of humanity? It doesn't make any sense.
I think there's been an interesting distinction in our discussion between women bishops, where there's an overwhelming feeling that the church ideally should change that soon, and gay marriage, which is much more contentious, and socially, although attitudes have changed, they've changed only in the last few decades. Do you think the church perhaps is rushing too much to go along with that too?
Well, I think the church has lost an opportunity, because I think we should have supported civil partnerships much more effectively 5-10 years ago when they were actually going through. And the nonsense now that the bishops and the archbishops are saying yes to civil partnerships, this is much better than gay marriage for the church, but on the other hand we're not prepared to bless them in churches, we're not prepared to provide liturgies for people who want to celebrate their partnership within the life of the church, I find astonishing. And the decision next weekend to actually put off a debate about this is frankly cowardly by the Church of England and disgraceful.
I mean, Peter, I'm just interested in, the fact that these are people who say they're Christians. You feel that they don't belong in the Church of England if they want to have a gay marriage?
I'm a broad church person. I think practically anybody who believes in God and particularly in the Christian gospel should be part of our church. There have always been huge divisions. That's the whole point of it. And the difficulty is, as I say, that those who want women bishops want to have total victory over those who oppose them, and there are people who it is absolutely true. In all conscience, there are people. I don't agree with them. Some of them are Anglo-Catholics, some of them are very evangelical Protestants. They can't accept the idea that women should be bishops.
Right.
They should have a corner left in which they can continue.
Absolutely.
They're not being allowed.
The Roman Catholic Church. That's where they
want
to flock to.
Well, there's an issue about whether they go to the Catholic Church. Can I bring in one other contributor, Peter? Just bear with me. Ephraim Buckle, you're an evangelical pastor at the Calvary Chapel in South London. I gather that you're very keen on bringing young people into the church. What do you make then of the argument that the church needs to move with the times? It needs to be more tolerant of the status of women and of homosexuality too.
I think it's very much dependent on people's concepts of modernisation. If modernisation means to depart from your defining values, if it means to depart from the truth of Scripture, if it means to reinterpret Scripture and redefine the substance of who we are, then I wouldn't say that I'm for modernisation.
But you don't believe in slavery, that's in the Bible.
The young people that I work with pastorally, they actually are looking for certainty, they're looking for authenticity, and so when Christians begin to reinterpret and redefine the text of Scripture, which they are able to access freely, it then suggests that actually you're being self-contradictory and I can't trust you.
Ephraim, thank you.
There are ways in which the church can move forward and be engaging without having to be biblically unfaithful.
All right, thank you. From Bonnie, last word to you.
Pastor Buckle's talking about his community, and it's a very important statement. He's talking about what his community needs from Christianity. And that's why Christianity has been successful, because it's able to do that, as opposed to, say, other religions. It can accommodate you. And now the question is, will women be able to participate in the full life of the church? They can't in Roman Catholicism, but there's a possibility in Anglican Catholicism.
We'll have to leave it there. A fascinating discussion. Thank you to all our contributors on webcam and in the studio. And later on Sunday Morning Live, forgiveness is part of the doctrine of many of the world's great religions, but is it always right to forgive? Remember, you can keep voting too in our text poll. The question, do families need fathers? If you think they do, text the word vote followed by yes. If you think they do not, then text vote followed by no. Our text number is 81771 and texts will be charged at your standard message rate. Remember, you can only vote once and you have about 5 minutes before the poll closes. It's time for our moral moments, where we look at some of the big stories of the week. And I think we're going to look first at the story of the 3-person IVF. Stephen, you were going to bring this up. Pioneered in London and being pushed by, in Newcastle, sorry, and being very much promoted by our health
it's a very exciting development, technologically, if you like, in terms of providing the opportunity for people who have maybe genetic lines within them which would produce illnesses within their children. And this is a way of actually enabling them to have children without those genetic problems. But all I would say is that although I welcome this move, it is something we have to keep our eyes on, because there is always within the whole scientific community a desire to move things on bit by bit by bit. At the bottom of the end of this, there is the design a baby concept, and the public needs a sense of confidence in a system which will be able to manage this particular flow of the scientific world in a way which prevents that sort of manipulation of the human gene to produce, if you like, the designer baby who's the ace footballer or the magnificent intellectual and so on. And we need assurance that our politicians have got a hold on this and are able to manage to make sure that that does not happen.
Bonnie, it's interesting because we already have 3-parent families. You can have a surrogate taking a donor egg with, insemination. Actually, there could be 4 parents in there.
We have these magnificent brains. I think it's very beautiful that this has happened, and I hope it goes as far as it possibly can, because we are defining humanity. If we can create human beings who are free from suffering, who are free from lives of pain, why shouldn't we do that? We have to do that, because that's the goal of science, is to make it possible for us to live on this earth.
Peter, I just wondered if you saw a difference between a choice about having a baby, say using a surrogate, there's situations in India where poor women are paid, and this which is just about preventing terrible conditions like muscular dystrophy.
I just feel emotionally manipulated by all these developments. I'm told that there are terrible things which are happening which could be avoided if they're done. And I can't help feeling that there are other implications of this which we're not exploring. I don't think we really know what the end of this would be if we pursued it to the end. The other thing is that it does involve, in some cases, the destruction of what I regard as a life. And I think that's a very dangerous thing to start licensing.
OK. Well, the other story, which I know that you've chosen, is that of Magistrate Yvonne Davis, who gave her personal opinion in a judgment in a cannabis sentencing case and has stepped down.
Well, stepped down under some pressure. She was reprimanded by the Lord Chief Justice and the Secretary of State for Justice. It seems to me to be astonishing but very telling that in this country officially cannabis is against the law. It's illegal to possess it, to grow it and to sell it. But a magistrate who actually tells somebody who's been convicted of farming cannabis that she feels that it would be that he would be advised to steer clear of it because of her own brother's terrible experience after smoking cannabis. He ended up committing suicide in very tragic circumstances. How can it possibly be that this is wrong? And I think it's a very, very important discovery for those of us who think that we have a serious criminal justice system, that a magistrate doing her job and giving somebody good advice based on her own sad, hard-bought experience is actually reprimanded by the people at the head of our justice system.
Bonnie, there is this argument made, isn't there? There's a very powerful pro-cannabis, the soft drug lobby, and that this is what this issue is really about.
In a secular society, the people who dispense our justice have no opinion. She had no business telling us what her life was about. It didn't matter. What mattered was the law. And the fact that she then decides to tell us her story, which is a horrible story, was out of order. and she shouldn't be on the bench.
I agree with that entirely. I think the magistrate actually stepped beyond the responsibility she'd been given by the state to exercise the law by using her own personal judgment and personal opinion about that. Once we go into that role, we shall have judges and magistrates putting their own personal stories in their judgment. We do not need that. That will be a disaster.
Judges are always commenting. Judges are always commenting.
Not from personal experience.
There is no suggestion that the conduct of the case was in any way improper. There's no suggestion that there was any prejudice in its conduct.
Stop it at the top.
There's no suggestion of prejudice in the length of the sentence. Purely after the conviction and sentence, she expressed an opinion which, in fact, technically is the opinion of the law.
No place in court.
Well,
I bet you wouldn't say that if the matter were reversed.
Let's leave that one. Thank you.
It's prejudice on your part.
It's not prejudice on my part.
Yes, it is.
It is not indeed.
Right.
You don't have any prejudice.
You have been voting. Peter Body, just we've got another discussion to go. We can let all this energy go somewhere positive. Now, you've all been voting in our text poll this morning. Do families need fathers? The poll is closing now, so please don't text, as your vote will not count, but you may still be charged, and we'll bring you the result at the end of the show. Now, this week, relatives of Nelson Mandela have sat vigil at his bedside as he remains in a critical condition. Mandela is still a revered figure who led South Africa out of the dark days of apartheid, state-imposed racial segregation, to true democracy. He spent 27 years in prison, branded a terrorist by the regime. But when he was freed, his greatest weapon was not the bomb or the bullet, but simple forgiveness. Every day they have come to pray for and praise the man that many South Africans regard as a member of their own family.
With the release of Mandela, the world changed. It was no longer possible for apartheid to rule in the old way.
People don't relate to Nelson Mandela purely as a great political leader or as a liberation hero. They relate to him at a personal level.
He led the nation to a new beginning, rejecting recrimination and revenge for a doctrine of peace and reconciliation. Mandela revisited his old cell in Robben Island with President Bill Clinton. But despite his years behind bars, Mandela wrote, "As I walked out of the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison." This weekend, another American president, Barack Obama, like Mandela, his country's first black leader, is in South Africa. He paid tribute to the man he described as his hero and a hero for the world. President Obama said his legacy will linger on throughout the ages. In many people's eyes, the greatest part of that legacy is forgiveness. And President Obama is visiting Robben Island today. Well, Mandela said hate has no future, but is it always right to forgive? What do you think? You can join in by webcam or make your point by phone, text, email or online. And we can hear the view of our studio guests on this one. Bonnie, you know, there's this narrative about Nelson Mandela, 27 years in jail, he comes out, it's truth and reconciliation. But you know, that was quite unique to his circumstances, wasn't it? The idea of forgiveness is perhaps being wrongly suggested it applies everywhere.
The moral life, which I think is above anything that has to do with religion or practicing religion, the moral life is a decision to live as a human being in spite of. And one of the highest things that we can do is to forgive. It's probably the hardest thing that we can do, but it's one of the highest things that we can do. And forgiveness not only begins with the human being, but it spreads out into the community as an example, and it creates a legacy. And I, for one, am astounded at the number of people in my life who have forgiven me, but also who have forgiven in circumstances that would be very, very difficult for me to do.
Peter?
Well, I think that forgiveness implies a desire on the part of the wrongdoer to be forgiven. And I find it difficult, verging on impossible, to forgive somebody who doesn't want to be forgiven. And I think there's all too much easy giveaway forgiveness being handed out in our society at the moment. I forgive such and such that somebody else has done to somebody else, rather than what somebody has done to me. When you're faced with somebody who's done something wrong to you, then, as far as I'm concerned, forgiveness can only begin when it's sought. And that's this devalued, soppy type of forgiveness, which seems to be very common these days, doesn't seem to me to be worth very much.
Forgive us our sins, as we forgive those who sin against us,
Exactly.
is a prayer which actually is said by Christians hopefully every day. And to me, the notion of forgiveness is central to the Christian faith, and what Mandela actually offered in South Africa was a sense of reconciliation to a nation which had been split apart by hatred and division and prejudice. And the notion of a rainbow nation which he brought in, where people came together in peace and reconciliation, which is something again that Archbishop Tutu has also played his part in creating in that nation, is a model for the world about how we resolve issues where we need that sense of forgiveness. And even now, this programme is coming from Northern Ireland, that need for forgiveness within the communities here is a vital part of the energy which we ought to be creating in our world.
Well, there's two things. One is, of course, many religions talk about forgiveness as being central, as well as Christianity. But also, if you give the example of Northern Ireland, the issue is whether you need truth with the reconciliation. And perhaps part of what Peter's talking about is it's easy to sort of say one should just forgive, but perhaps there needs to be an honest accounting from the perpetrator.
Peter's absolutely right. There's too much of that word being thrown around on talk shows. It has been devalued, like love. That word is devalued as well. Yeah. But forgiveness is an action. It isn't simply sitting back and saying it. It begins a process. Part of that process is the sinking out of reconciliation. We must reconcile when forgiveness comes in.
For example, Peter, when a government apologises, as the Australian government has, for historical abuse of Aboriginal peoples or for slavery, there's been some issues about what Tony Blair said, are those meaningless because they're not being said by the person?
Not always meaningless, because sometimes they have a big political purpose. And for instance, when the British government apologised for the Irish famine, part of me said, oh, don't be silly. The other part said, well, actually, there is a shameful failure among a lot of English people to recognise to this day what a terrible thing that was, and it was probably worthwhile. And in that, it's the extent of recognising past wrongs, yes, but you can't apologise for things you didn't do. And we mustn't mix them up, and that's what governments tend to do, apologising for things they didn't do, while in many cases, in fact, invariably not apologising for the things that they are doing.
Right, well, I want to bring in a couple on webcam who've been very kind to join us, Ray and Vi Donovan, who have been through an experience. It's hard to believe, and thank you for speaking to us. Your son was murdered, by a gang of people, and 3 young men were convicted of that murder in 2001. You've heard us discussing this idea of forgiveness. Can you tell us what it was like to have that experience and how easy it was for you to forgive, because you have met one of his murderers?
Hey. Hello?
Hello.
No, we've not just met one, we met 3 of them.
You've met 3 of them. And tell us about how you came to do it and how far forgiveness has been something you felt able to give.
Well, we met them through the new programme in England called Restorative Justice. We were able to visit, well, they're out of prison now, so they don't gain nothing, in case Hitchens think they're only doing it for their own benefit. They're out of prison now. We met all 3 on 3 different occasions.
And I understand, Ray and Vi, that one of them, he's gone to visit the grave of your son with you. You've actually got a kind of relationship, and he said that his life has changed as a result. How does that work? How do you feel about that? Vi?
Yes, initially we wanted answers to our questions. We wanted the truth from him. We chose to forgive, and forgiveness is a choice, a conscious decision. It's how you understand forgiveness. It's not saying he didn't do it. It's not saying I allow you off. It's saying I choose to forgive you. It's not about how you feel. And so we remembered that, and we chose to forgive, and it's an everyday choice. We went to the grave with him. We wanted him to come to terms with that. We wanted him to move on as well as we needed to move on, and that's why we did it.
And Ray, you've heard the argument that perhaps in some circumstances actually you can't forgive, and if they don't seek forgiveness, perhaps you don't give it either. What's your view on that?
Load of nonsense. Stuff and nonsense. I forgive the boys that night because they did, they took Christopher and I've taken my life.
So it's about freeing yourselves?
It is. It's freeing, forgiveness is setting the prisoner free and finding out the prisoner's you.
Thank you.
And then, there's another old saying, if you're looking for revenge, be prepared to dig 2 graves.
Ray and Vi, thank you very much. It is a remarkable story. I mean,
Yes,
Stephen.
Prepared to dig 2 graves if you don't forgive. I mean, I think that is very interesting because the lack of forgiveness actually can bind you and you end up bitter, and that sense of needing revenge all the time can in fact destroy your life as well. And that's the great gift that we just heard from them, that actually they've given us as an example of how to forgive under those circumstances.
And what Ray and Vi have said too that's most important is they chose life. They chose to continue to live. They're not missionaries. They're not out trying to convert anybody. They chose to live in the wake of their son's death. It's a very high human choice. It's very, very difficult, but it does give back. And they are the examples of it. And we have choices to make. It's not easy to do. It is not even a typical thing to do. But the fact that they did it actually has enlarged their community in many ways.
I want to ask Peter what you think.
Well, I don't want to intrude into private grief, but the fundamental person who was offended against in this matter was the murdered boy. And he is in no position to forgive, and we do not know what he thinks. Ray and Vi may forgive the murderer for the horrible grief which the murderer inflicted upon them, but it doesn't seem to me to be within their power. It doesn't seem to me to be within. Doesn't seem. If you could just not interrupt me for once, it doesn't seem to me to be within their power to forgive on behalf of the murdered boy.
It's a specific concern. There's huge sympathy and respect for you both. But Ray, it's the idea that in the end, there's a certain bit of forgiveness that only your son could give. What do you make of that?
Well, Peter doesn't know my son. Let's get something straight for you. He can't speak on behalf of my son. My son was a forgiving boy. Yeah? That's why we took him to the grave, because I turned to that young man and I said, on behalf of we're all here, Christopher's here, we're here. If Christopher was alive, he would say to you, get on with your life, move on.
Ray and Vi,
he's not alive.
thank you. Well, Peter, let's leave it there. I want Ray and Vi to have the last word on that. Thank you so much for speaking to us about your family's experience. We really appreciate it. You know, it is this idea about choices, and I think many people could see the distinction between parental forgiveness and the idea that the crime itself and the victim of that might be something different. I want to bring in one other contributor, if I can, who is quite well known because she's spoken out a lot. Kitty, I know you're only on the phone able to speak to us. Many may have heard before about your experiences because you survived Auschwitz and you saw all the atrocities that were carried out there. And you've chosen to speak out about it and campaign on it still. It's clearly important that we never forget. But should we forgive?
Well, first of all, we must not confuse revenge with forgiveness, because that came up in your discussion. There's two totally different aspects, okay? Now, I was in Auschwitz-Birkenau for 2 years as an eyewitness to the greatest crime in human history. My opinions have not changed over the years. There are crimes that are unforgivable. Who am I to forgive? This came up, actually, in your discussion. I have no right to forgive all these people that have died. And believe you me, anyone who witnessed what I have seen would pretty well feel the same. Let me just, I mean, if you give me 2 minutes, I will just explain.
As briefly as you can, we thank you for your time.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, out of my 2 years, in my second year in Auschwitz, I was taken to work near the gas chambers, 4 gas chambers. I watched the murder of something like 10,000 people each day, every day, which is quite difficult to comprehend.
It is.
Yes, that's right, very difficult. I was made to sort out the belongings. Now, these people who were brought in, totally innocent, were sitting in the wood, not across the way from the gas chambers. They had no conception of what was going to happen to them. Okay? That's the first thing to say. They were just sitting there, having tumbled out of the cattle trucks, or they were shut in perhaps 7 days or so. So, in groups, they were led into a building, right? The next thing was, the corpses were laid out outside, heaped up, waiting to be burned. Then, of course, you saw the ash come out. Okay, well, these are murders of innocent people that cannot be forgiven by anyone else here. That some higher authority may be, but not. No, wait a minute.
Kitty, I just want to, I'm really conscious that you're telling us about something so appalling, but I would like to have a response from the panel, so just bear with us. There is just for a moment, Kitty, there is this idea that the Holocaust is something which is unforgivable. But there have been Nazis who showed remorse, and I just wondered from the panel if this is something almost different, it's set aside as the exception that proves the rule.
No, it's a larger example of the simple point. The person who has to forgive is the person against whom the offence has been committed. If that person is dead, then you're left with a big difficulty there. We cannot forgive on behalf of the dead, and we should not try to do so. Whether it is one dead person or 6 million dead people, we cannot forgive on behalf of the dead, and we should not pretend that we can. That is for a higher authority to do.
Of course we can't, but a community has been offended against as well. A family has been offended against. Yes, of course, you can't make it better for an individual, but a community can make a decision about whether it forgives. And I agree with Kitty. I've been to Auschwitz. There's no way I could have forgiven the Nazis for that, and it didn't happen to my community. There is no way, but a community can make a decision about itself in relation to its own history and its own being. And that's what Vi and Ray have done. They've made that decision on behalf of their family. They can't do it for their child, but they can do it for their family.
And the Jewish people have had to make that decision as well with the German nation. In a sense, it was the German nation against the Jewish people, an act which was quite extraordinary in human history. But in the end, there's had to be reconciliation between those two peoples and a sense of coming together in a world where they actually have to learn from the disaster of Auschwitz and the genocide to a world where people can actually live in harmony and peace.
There had to be punishments too in that case.
There were, yes.
Well, we'll have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Kitty, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to us. I know that it's never ideal to discuss something like this so briefly, but thank you, and thank you to all our panel. We do have to end it there because your text poll votes are in, and we asked, do families need fathers? And here is what you told us. 85% of those of you who texted in said yes, it is, and 15% said no. I think we always knew that this discussion was going to be one that would kind of rouse kind of strong emotions. But I think it is interesting that the wording of it is fair enough, wasn't it? Because of this issue of whether the state has made fatherhood an optional extra.
Well, I don't quite think it's made fatherhood an optional extra. I still think fathers play an important role in families. Our poll suggests that is the case in the minds of most people. Fathers should be there if at all possible, but that's not denying the value of families where fathers aren't there for one reason or another.
Exactly, that is my point. The most important thing are children and making the families that they're born into, however they're born into, as stable and safe and nurturing as possible. If this includes a father, and like I said, I grew up with a dad, I'm all for it, I support fatherhood. But the most important thing is children.
I wonder what's the way forward, Peter, partly?
Reform. Now we have to recognise that we've made a major mistake in removing fatherhood from so many people. It was a mistake, it's doing harm, so why don't we put it right? It's the most extraordinary thing about the liberal agenda of the 1960s and 70s, that although it's created so many bad things, we never go back and re-examine it. It's time we did.
What would you change? Was that about just recognising? Well, I mean, how would you change that?
I would make marriage stronger. I would make it much harder.
Much harder.
Right? Well, it was legislated. Its current weakness was legislated in 1969, and it has not since been seriously reformed.
All right, Stephen.
Well, I just don't understand this. I mean, actually, the quality of a marriage is based on the relationship between two people and the way that relationship functions, of tolerance, acceptance, and so on and so forth. And that is what is vital in a relationship, not what the law says.
Marriage, again, this idea of the traditional family is a modern construct. It doesn't go all the way back in our history. And I've lived long enough to see marriage redefined in relationship to women. It's always been redefined and always will be.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thanks to everybody.